Hi guys, I'm Dimension Jumper today reviewing The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which was released in 1991 in Japan and 1992 in Europe and North America. So, the main plot of this game is that basically Link has to stop this guy called Aghanim, who's basically sending these maidens to a different world so he can release Ganon, and it's up to Link to basically beat him. And along Link's journey, he basically has to find these pendants that can help him find the Master Sword. Then later save the maidens have been teleported or summoned, transported, I think, to the other world. And yeah, so on and so forth. He does those sort of things in, I think, Master Sword first, and then he goes to the other world. And I think this game is probably one of the first out of two games to really push Zelda into popularity. The second being Ocarina of Time. Don't get me wrong. The other two Zelda games that were released before A Link to the Past, those being the original Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link, weren't, even though they did sell well, I think it wasn't until A Link to the Past when I think the Zelda games or the and Zelda franchise really took off, because I think the story and also the gameplay and a lot of other stuff in A Link to the Past, I think laid the groundwork for a lot of other games, including several other Zelda games in the future. And it's kind of easy to see why, mainly because I think with where Nintendo goes with their stories, for whether it's Mario or Zelda or Metroid or whatever, I think they really do focus on the story, and I think the story in A Link to the Past does well, because it was probably the first Zelda game to basically expand on not only the whole Zelda lore, but also basically expands on other stuff. So how we find out who Ganon probably is. We find out who Link is. We find out who all of these people are, kind of, because they expand on every stuff and other stuff like that. And I think this game, it's a really good way of using existing plot elements, but also adding more to it. So, for example, the Triforce, you get it at the very end of the game, and you bring peace to Hyrule, and it also has these seven maidens, which will then later become the seven sages. And I think this is done well, because I think with the seven maidens slash the seven sages, I think they do it well with how much they trying for Link to basically save all of these sages and basically help you defeat Aghanim. Now, the dungeons in this game are quite cool, because I think there's your traditional fire dungeon, your forest dungeon, your water dungeon, but I think each dungeon does them differently, in other games, because I think it's how you try and focus on how they do it. And also, this is the first game to introduce some new items, so the hook shot, what other items? The flute, which kind of look like an ocarina, the lantern, and various other items. And I think they use the items well in this game, because of how you can use them both in the dungeons and outside the dungeons. So, for example, you might get the hook shot, and you can use it to basically do your various puzzles in the dungeon with that item, and also beat the boss with a particular item. And I think with each dungeon boss, I think these are kind of some of the unique ones in the Zelda games, because you've got, even though you got like, you know, well-known bosses like Dodongo, Ganondorf / Ganon, Koloktos. I think this is where the bosses kind of like had a bit of more shine, because you got bosses like the Helm Rock King, which is basically a giant boss that basically fills up the entire boss room, and it's like, you know, really intimidating, really menacing looking. But then you've got bosses like Moldorm, or Trolldorm as people like to call him, who's basically just an annoying boss, and every time you get pushed off the boss stage in the boss room, you basically have to restart the battle again. And I think, you know, Trolldorm is remembered for all of the worst reasons, because he's like, you know, a really bad boss who basically just is kind of there. I think like with Trolldorm or Moldorm, however you like to call him, I think he was just there to fill out the boss roster and like with all the bosses. And also I do like Aghanim, because if you look at the games, you know, when they were released, Aghanim was the very first boss to introduce the volleyball, energy ball, tennis thing, in which it's when a particular boss, most likely, well, more like well known likely, which is Ganondorf, is when he releases like, you know, energy balls, and you basically have to deflect them back with your sword, and it's basically kind of like tennis, but instead of, you know, scoring points, you get one person gets hit by energy balls of death. And yeah, and now it's time for some gameplay. Now the gameplay is basically simple. You basically hold the, you basically press the B button, basically swinging your sword. But if you hold the B button, you can basically do a spin attack, and I think that's quite cool, because, you know, it's basically tradition in Zelda games to do a spin attack, and you can basically hit a bunch of enemies at once. You can also press, like, you know, the pause button to basically bring up your items. But however, this is kind of a downgrade, because you can only use like one at a time, unlike in the previous games before Link to the Past and future ones, in which in Link to the Past you can only use one at a time. So for example, if I wanted to use my bow and arrows, I could just basically do that and basically press the Y button to basically try and hit the enemy. And yeah, so I kind of wish they had like, you know, you have like use multiple items at once, and also you got like non-equipable items which you can use, like, you know, on the fly, like the Pegasus boot, if you just press the A button, which makes you go at like, you know, super speed, kind of like Sonic, but not really, because yeah, it just makes you go fast. And like in the original Zelda game, every time you go to a new area, the screen goes, you know, like to the side and stuff like that. And also I do like how you use the items you can use, like outside of dungeons, how you can use the hook shot to get to other sides, like the bridge just now. I just like how, like, I think it's just like a really good game, like, you know, enjoy for a bit, but it is kind of limited, mainly because it's 2D. With other games in the Zelda series, like, you know, Breath of the Wild, Ocarina of Time, Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, where those games are in 3D, and those games can, like, basically do anything because they're in 3D. But I do feel like this game is a bit limited for its time, and it can get boring a bit. Like, you know, it's like, because it's just in 2D, and it's like, it's just not that much else. I don't know, it's not too much to expect from it because it's just 2D. It kind of reminds me of like how better the Zelda games have gotten, like, you know, design wise and like graphically, because in Breath of the Wild you can basically just climb, like, you know, anything, and in A Link to the Past it's not really that possible. It's just we basically just go into caves and wait for the loading screen, and yeah, it's just like, yeah. So that's it for the gameplay. Now it's time to go back to the review. So later in the game, you find out that Aghanim is actually Ganon, and I think it's because I think it's because like Ganon wanted to try and like free himself from the Dark World, and he wanted to try and like use the seven maidens or sages to basically free himself properly, and I think plunge Hyrule into the Dark World and overrun it with monsters. I think I can't exactly remember. I think that's it. I think because I've watched some videos on it, and I think that's how it is. And also I think the boss fight with Ganon is quite cool because he basically teleports around the room. He's got his trident, and I think that Ganon, I think this version of Ganon is okay because it's his pig form. It's like his blue pig form, kind of like in the original Zelda game, how that Ganon was blue, and I think it's quite cool of like how they bring some of the color schemes back from previous games, and how menacing Ganon looks, because with Ganondorf, like in Twilight Princess, Ocarina of Time, and the upcoming Breath of the Wild sequel, I think Ganondorf is a bit more specifically, it's like even though he's menacing, I don't think he's like even though he's menacing, I think when he becomes Ganon, I think that's when he becomes slightly more menacing, even though he's just a big dumb pig. I think like you can't really have one without the other. It's kind of like fish and chips, bacon and eggs, that sort of thing. You can't really have Ganon without Ganondorf, and I think even though Link to the Past is set in the Fallen Hero timeline, the only timeline without Ganondorf, I think it's still like a good way of showing how powerful Ganon can be without the use of his human body. And it's a really cool way of showing Ganon the peak of his power. I think that's how you see Ganon in the Fallen Hero timeline. And so for my final verdict is that I think A Link to the Past is a really unique game. I think this is what, again, the two Zelda games, well, one of the two Zelda games that really pushed Zelda into the limelight, and really showed how both not only Zelda games but also video games could be when it comes to the way that the game plays, the way that it uses the story, and just how Zelda games could be Zelda games. And I think this is a revolutionary mark in terms of Zelda games, because we wouldn't have probably a lot of the other Zelda games if it wasn't for the first three Zelda games, the original Zelda, Adventure of Link, and A Link to the Past, so that it could inspire more games in that series, like Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, and all of those other games. And so yeah, that's been my review for A Link to the Past. I hope you enjoyed that video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and see you in the next video.